You ever win something you've been praying for and then feel absolutely nothing? Like you're standing there and everyone's celebrating and you're supposed to feel different. But inside, just quiet. Not peace. Not joy. Just quiet. That's not backsliding. That's not doubt creeping in. That's just what happens when you've been running on fumes disguised as faith. And nobody warns you about that part. They tell you about the mountain. They tell you about the breakthrough. They tell you God shows up in fire. But they don't tell you what happens the day after the fire falls. When you wake up and the miracle is yesterday's news and you still feel like you're barely holding it together. Elijah knew that feeling. Not the backslidden prophet version we like to preach about. Not the he just needed more faith version. The real one. The one where you love God deeply, serve Him faithfully, and still end up under a tree whispering, I can't do this anymore. And the wildest part? God didn't argue with him. Didn't give him a motivational speech. Didn't say, buck up, prophet. God let him sleep, fed him, and then asked him the gentlest, most devastating question. What are you doing here? Not in judgment, in curiosity. Like God was saying, tell me what happened. I'm listening. And if you've ever felt like the fire left and forgot to take you with it, if you've ever wondered why you can be faithful and still feel empty, this isn't ancient history. This is tonight. Let me tell you the story they don't usually tell. Not the highlight reel. The whole thing. The part where the prophet of fire ran out of flame. Elijah wasn't supposed to be anybody. No royal blood. No temple training. No famous father to open doors. He's from Tishbe. And if you're sitting there thinking, where's Tishbe? Exactly. Nobody knew where Tishbe was either. It was the kind of place you drove through on the way to somewhere important. Elijah was a nobody from nowhere. And one day, he just shows up, walks into King Ahab's palace like he owns the place, and says, no introduction, no credentials, no your majesty, if I may. Just, there's not going to be rain until I say so. And then he leaves. That's it. Mic drop. Exit, stage left. Now, imagine being Ahab. You're the king. You've got armies, advisors, priests on payroll. And some guy in a leather belt and a bad attitude just walked in, declared a drought, and dipped. You'd laugh. Until the rain stopped. And it didn't stop for a day. Or a week. Or a month. 3.5 years. No rain. Crops dead. Economy collapsing. People starving. And the whole time, Elijah's just gone. Hiding by a brook. Being fed by birds, which, let's be honest, sounds poetic until you imagine what ravens actually eat. Then the brook dries up. So God sends him to a widow. Not a rich widow. Not a connected widow. A widow so poor she's about to cook her last meal and then just wait to die. And Elijah shows up like, hey, make me some bread first. Which sounds insane. Until you realize, God wasn't testing her generosity. He was introducing her to multiplication. She made the bread, and the flour didn't run out. The oil didn't run dry. For years, Elijah didn't just survive. He learned something in that house. God doesn't always provide the way you expect. Sometimes He sends birds. Sometimes He sends widows. Sometimes He hides you until the world is desperate enough to listen. And after 3 years of silence, Elijah walks back into the story like he never left. Mount Carmel. If you grew up in church, you know this story. But let me tell it to you the way it actually felt. King Ahab had spent 3 years blaming Elijah for the drought. Not himself. Not the false gods he'd been promoting. Elijah. So when Elijah finally shows his face again, Ahab's first words are, Is that you, you troublemaker? And Elijah doesn't flinch. I'm not the troublemaker. You are. You and your whole family. Then he makes an offer. Let's settle this. Your gods versus mine. Let's see who answers. Ahab agrees. Because at this point, what does he have to lose? So they gather on Mount Carmel. Elijah, 450 prophets of Baal, and a whole nation watching. Elijah sets the terms. Build an altar. Put a sacrifice on it. Pray to your God. I'll pray to mine. Whichever one sends fire wins. Simple. Public. No room for tricks. The prophets of Baal go first. And they go hard. Shouting. Dancing. Cutting themselves. Begging. Hours pass. Morning turns to afternoon. And nothing happens. Elijah starts mocking them, which is both hilarious and kind of savage. Maybe your God's in the bathroom. Maybe he's on vacation. Maybe he's taking a nap. Yell louder. It's funny, until you realize Elijah's not just being sarcastic. He's making a point. Your desperation doesn't move a God who isn't real. By evening, the prophets are exhausted, bleeding, broken, and still, nothing. Then it's Elijah's turn. He rebuilds an old altar, digs a trench around it, arranges the wood, lays the sacrifice on top, and then he does something nobody expected. He drenches it with water. In a drought, he pours water over the altar until it's soaked, fills the trench, makes it impossible for this to be a trick, and then he prays. Not loud, not long, just honest. God, let them know you're real. That's it. And fire falls. Not a spark, not smoke. Fire. The kind that consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, the dirt, and even the water in the trench. The kind that makes everyone fall to their knees. And in that moment, Elijah looks untouchable, like a man who'd never known fear, like faith incarnate. This is where we usually end the story. Victory. Fire. Faith wins. Roll credits. But the Bible doesn't stop there. Because what happened next is the part nobody preaches. And it's the part that makes this story real. After Mount Carmel, Elijah does something nobody saw coming. He runs. Not in triumph. In terror. Because Jezebel, Ahab's wife, the queen who'd been funding those false prophets, sends him a message. You killed my prophets. I'm going to kill you tomorrow. And Elijah, the man who just called down fire from heaven, the man who stood alone against 450 prophets, the man who mocked false gods to their faces, gets scared, and he runs. Not to another city, not to rally support. He runs into the wilderness, alone, sits under a tree, and prays the most honest prayer in the Bible. I've had enough, Lord. Just let me die. Not poetic. Not spiritual. Just raw. And here's the part that breaks me every time. God doesn't correct him. Doesn't rebuke him. Doesn't say, where's your faith? You just saw fire fall. God sends an angel. And the angel doesn't preach. Doesn't lecture. Just touches Elijah gently and says, eat. Elijah eats. Goes back to sleep. The angel comes back. Eat again. You've got a long journey ahead. That's it. No sermon about faith. No motivational speech. Just rest. Food. Compassion. Because God knew something we forget. Elijah wasn't sinful. He was depleted. There's a difference. You can be faithful and exhausted. You can love God and still feel empty. You can do everything right and still hit a wall. And God doesn't shame you for that. He feeds you, lets you rest, and walks with you through it. Elijah eventually gets up, but he doesn't go back to the crowds. He goes to a mountain, to a cave, and he hides. Not from enemies, from everything. And God meets him there too, asks him a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? Not accusatory, gentle, curious. And Elijah answers honestly, I've been zealous for you. I've done everything right, and I'm alone, and it didn't work. That's not rebellion. That's heartbreak. And then, God does something beautiful. He doesn't come in the earthquake, not in the wind, not in the fire. He comes in a whisper. Because sometimes, when the fire is gone, God doesn't get louder. He gets closer. Here's what the Sunday school version doesn't tell you. Elijah spent years in the wilderness. Not days. Not weeks. Years. And during that time, he wasn't performing miracles. He wasn't preaching to crowds. He wasn't the hero of anybody's story. He was just there, surviving, learning, becoming. And I think that's the part we need to hear most. Because we live in a world that celebrates the highlight reel, the breakthrough, the testimony, the moment fire falls. But nobody talks about the years between miracles, the years where you're faithful, and it feels like nothing's happening, where you're praying and heaven feels silent, where you're doing everything right and still waking up tired. Elijah had those years, and God didn't waste them. He wasn't punishing Elijah. He was preparing him. For what? For the next thing. Because here's the truth they don't tell you. The fire isn't the end goal. The fire is just the announcement. The real work happens in the waiting, in the quiet, in the cave. That's where you learn who God is when he's not performing for a crowd. That's where you learn to trust him when you can't see him. That's where your faith stops being about what God does and starts being about who God is. And Elijah learned that. Slowly, painfully, honestly. He learned that God doesn't need you to be strong all the time. He learned that rest isn't rebellion. He learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just keep breathing. And here's the part that wrecks me. God never left him. Not once. Not when Elijah ran. Not when Elijah doubted. Not when Elijah wanted to die. God stayed, fed him, whispered to him, and eventually gave him something Elijah didn't even know he needed. A friend. God tells Elijah to anoint someone, a young guy named Elisha, not as a replacement, as a companion. And at first, Elijah resists. Because when you've been alone for so long, you forget how to let people in. You start to believe the lie that if you need help, you're weak. That if you're struggling, you've failed. That if you can't carry it alone, you don't deserve to carry it at all. But God wasn't asking Elijah if he wanted help. He was giving it to him anyway. Because God knew what Elijah couldn't see. You were never meant to do this alone. The fire fell on Carmel, but Elijah still needed someone to walk with him after. And when Elisha shows up, Elijah doesn't have to perform anymore. Doesn't have to pretend. Doesn't have to be the untouchable prophet. He just gets to be human. And Elisha doesn't judge him for it. Doesn't try to fix him. Just walks with him. And slowly, Elijah starts to heal. Not because the circumstances changed. Not because he got stronger. But because he finally let someone in. And maybe that's what you need to hear tonight. You're not failing because you need people. You're not weak because you can't do it alone. You're human. And God never designed you to carry this by yourself. The enemy wants you isolated. Convinced that if people knew what you were really feeling, they'd leave. Convinced that if you admitted you're struggling, you'd be disqualified. But that's a lie. Elijah thought he was the only one left. God said, there are 7,000 others. You're not alone. You never were. Let me talk to you for a second. Not as a content creator. Not as someone trying to teach you something. Just human to human. If you're watching this at 2 a.m. because you can't sleep, if you clicked on this video because the title felt personal, if you've been serving, praying, believing, and still feel empty, I need you to know something. You're not broken. You didn't do something wrong. You didn't lose your faith. You're just tired. And that's okay. God doesn't need you to be strong right now. He just needs you to be honest. Elijah said, "I've had enough." And God didn't shame him. He fed him, let him rest, and stayed. So, if you're in the cave tonight, if the fire feels gone and you can't remember the last time you felt close to God, He hasn't left. He's just whispering now. Because sometimes shouting would hurt. You don't have to have it all together. You don't have to fake joy. You don't have to pretend you're not struggling. God already knows. And He's not disappointed. He's not angry. He's not far. He's right there, in the cave with you, saying the same thing He said to Elijah. Eat. Rest. You've got a long journey ahead. And I'm not letting you walk it alone. If this story felt like it was written for you, if it put words to something you've been carrying quietly, you're welcome here. This isn't a channel that's going to guilt you into feeling better, or shame you for being tired, or pretend that faith means never struggling. This is a place for people who love God and still feel human. For people who are doing their best, and it still doesn't feel like enough. For people who need to hear that the fire fading doesn't mean God left. Sometimes He's just teaching you to see Him in the whisper. If you want more stories like this, hit subscribe. Not because I need the numbers, but because you might need the reminder. You're not alone. You never were. And the fire isn't gone. It's just resting. Like you.